State Forest is right next door, and so we can go out our front door and walk all the way up to the fire tower. Mushrooms are fruit in the same way that you think of an apple as being a fruit. Apple grows on the tree, and mushroom grows off the mycelium, which is either in the soil or in whatever it's growing off of. Sometimes it's leaves, sometimes it's rotting wood. And a huge number of the mushrooms that grow here in the forest areas are what we call mycorrhizal. And mycorrhizal, myco is of course fungus root. And so the fungus mycelium is able to connect with the root of the tree. And so what happens is it becomes more or less an extension of the root system. And so the health of the forest and the health of the trees is very dependent on the kind of mushrooms that grow around them. And so a good share of the mushrooms that we find here throughout the season are mycorrhizal. And so they're growing in this symbiosis with the trees. And just as we're speaking, here is one. This is called Suillus pictus, or Suillus spraguei, and it's interesting because it's growing right at the base of this tulip poplar. But what we know about this mushroom is that it's actually a mycorrhizal partner of eastern white pine. And so lots of times when you find these different mycorrhizal species, some of them are very specific to a certain host, and they only grow with those particular hosts. Others are less specific. They'll grow either on all different hardwoods or different conifers. And in a few cases they cross that also. They'll grow on either one. But Suillus spraguei or Suillus pictus, also known as the painted bolete, is a good edible, and it's a really common mushroom during most summers. Even during dry times it seems to thrive. And you can see the underside, what we call it a bolete because on the underside it has pores rather than gills, and so we'll see some others that I can show you the comparison, but the pores are where the spores come from. And so that's the first thing you look at when you pick up a mushroom is, does it have pores or does it have gills? And then of course from there you go into how it produces the spores and what the color of the spores are. And so all that is information that you put together. There's not, people ask me all the time about the one trick or the one thing that tells you whether a mushroom is edible or poisonous, and that just really doesn't exist. Every mushroom that you pick, you should be able to match it with, I usually say at least 7 characteristics. And if you can match it that far, then it becomes safe, for you to be able to experiment a little bit. So you've avoided all the poisonous ones, or mostly poisonous ones, and most of the ones even that taste bad. And that's the category that a lot fall in. When you think of mushrooms, most people think of the typical umbrella-shaped formation, but lots of mushrooms grow as like clubs or clusters of coral, and they're called coral and club fungi. There's many different species of those, different colors. A lot of them are also mycorrhizal. Fortunately we live in an area where the diversity of fungi and the diversity of plants is very, very high compared to most places around here. And so in North America, the southern Appalachians has by far the greatest diversity of species of fungi. Here's another one, and see, when you look on the underside of this one, you see that it has gills instead of pores. And you look at the shape and the color and all the, like the rings of color on the top of the cap, the stem, what it's growing under and what it's growing around. And then you can take your fingernail and just kind of scratch it. And it's hard to see with this one, but what I'm seeing is it's bleeding. There is a liquid that's coming out, and that's called latex. And so that tells me that this is a mushroom in the genus Lactarius, or in the group Lactarius. And within Lactarius are some of our most favorite edibles, and we'll look at some of those. Guild mushroom. You see it has gills also, very different color, very different, a little bit of a different shape, but when you injure it, it also bleeds. So there's a milk coming out of that. And in the case of a lot of the non-edible species of Lactarius, if you touch your finger to the milk and touch it to the tip of your tongue, you get this really hot sensation, kind of like a hot pepper. And so those are the ones that we typically don't eat. They're not really poison, but they're considered a gastrointestinal irritant. And so if you eat those, then you're likely to have an unpleasant experience. And they don't taste so good. Probably people walk by all the time and never even notice these things growing on the ground. So this one, you can see on the underside, it really doesn't have gills, and it has this trumpet shape. The stem is kind of hollow, the top is really dark, almost black, and the underside has this sort of gray color to it. And so what that tells me is that what we found here is a patch of what some people call poor man's truffles. They're one of the real prized choice mushrooms that have a lot of the characteristics of truffles, which are a lot more expensive and a lot more rare. But you know, these, we call them black trumpet chanterelles, and so they grow in these mossy banks and things. They're mycorrhizal with the hardwood trees. There is another species that's similar, that's mycorrhizal with conifers. But we collect them like this and take them in, and usually the way we handle black trumpet chanterelles is we'll dry them and just completely dehydrate them, put them in a jar and store them for the winter. And so then when we get ready to eat them, we take them out and soak them in water and reduce the water because it has all the flavor in it, and then chop them up and use them in anything from omelets to cream sauces. They're very highly sought after edible mushroom. You don't really see them in the marketplace that much. Occasionally you can find some that are dried, but that's mostly because they really can't be cultivated. Because they're mycorrhizal with the trees, you have to cultivate the trees that then grow the mushrooms. So one of the things that we always do for two reasons. One reason is to keep edible and non-edible species separate in our basket. The other is that if we collect something that we want to take in for study, we want it to be in good shape when we get there. And so if you just fill up your basket with a bunch of random mushrooms, by the time you get back to set them up on the table, they're all crumbled up and they're not very pretty. And so we carry these wax paper bags, or sometimes just a brown paper sandwich bag, and we put the edibles in those and keep them separate. And then in the case of other mushrooms that we are trying to preserve for further study, we will do the same thing and just kind of make a little pouch for it that protects it and keeps it from getting crushed up. So when we get back and set them up on the table for identification, we can really see what the fresh mushroom is like. One of the things that is always fascinating is like in this same area, you're seeing these black trumpets. So here's another mushroom. And of course, this one is the painted bolete, which was the first one that we picked and saw. So the painted bolete is mycorrhizal with the conifers. And so you've got two different species that have completely different partners that are both growing in the same place together like that. And so in terms of being able to go out and collect mushrooms for food, once you really get to know a number of species like this, during the season you don't have to go very far. There's lots to pick from. And of course, there's a high number of things that are beautiful but not necessarily edible too. So. Another gilled mushroom, very different from anything we've seen so far. It doesn't have any milk, so it's not bleeding when I handle it. And it has these gills that are kind of brownish with a little bit of whitish tint, so it's going to have white spores. And this one is called Lactarius, and Lactarius is a genus that doesn't contain any toxic species, so it's a good safe one to go with. So back to the idea of keeping these things in good shape so we can see them, so we can identify them. I collect these little tackle boxes, and so you can open up the tackle box, and a small mushroom like that, you can just put it in there, close it up, and then when you get back, you've got the mushroom in perfect condition to be able to look at for identification. So this one is another gilled mushroom. You can see on the underside that it has gills. It has this white stalk with no ring or ornamentation on it or anything, just whitish, and then the top has this kind of green center going to almost purple in the outer rings of it. So this is in the genus Russula. Many different kinds of Russulas. They come in every color in the rainbow. There's a few that are good edibles, a lot that are too peppery to eat, and not any that grow here that I'm aware of that have any kind of toxins in them. There's probably a dozen or so that we would put in the category of good edibles. And obviously this one growing right here under this pine tree, mycorrhizal with the pine. But then there's these other things growing right beside it. You pick this one up, another gilled mushroom, but looks very different. You can see the concentric rings up on the top of it. And when I damage the gills, you can see the milk coming out. So this is another Lactarius, very likely mycorrhizal with the same species, the tree. So in the case of Lactarius, there's so many different species, and because none of them are dangerous, we encourage using the rule of thumb. Of course there's other characteristics you want to look at too, but of like just putting your finger, touching it like that, getting a little bit, and just put it on the tip of your tongue. And if you get this hot reaction, and of course either way you spit it out, and then if you get this hot sensation, then that tells you that this is not one that you want to take in for the pot. This little mushroom is, of course, in the coral mushroom family. This is one of the jelly corals, and so it produces its spores up on the tips, the very tips of all these branches are where the spores come from. And so it's really different from the gilled or poroid mushrooms, and so to do a spore print, you just have to lay it on its side and cover it on a piece of paper and cover it with a cup or something to keep it from drying out, and you'll see the spores coming out the end, and that'll help you to be able to identify two species definitively. Yeah, there's much room to talk about here. So you can see that this mushroom, it has a fairly long stalk in proportion to the cap. And so one of the things with these types of mushrooms that we emphasize is it's important to collect everything all the way down to the base, because lots of times some of the most important taxonomic details are right at the base of the mushroom. So this one, you can see, has this sort of cup-like formation, and then it has a little like skirt-like ring on the stem, and it has gills. And then on the top of the cap, you see these little flakes. They almost look like coconut flakes, and so they're called universal veil remnants. So that puts this mushroom in the genus Amanita. By far the most of the deadly poisonous species of mushrooms are in that genus. There's some good edibles in it too, but it's one of those lines that you only cross once you really have a lot of experience. It's a graduation. But by understanding this feature of having a universal veil, if you imagine this mushroom being inside an egg, and so the shell breaks open, the stem elongates, and up out of the egg comes this mushroom. And so sometimes the membrane, that's the egg shell, sticks to the cap, and so as it expands, it leaves these little flakes on top of it. So this is in the genus of what most people think of as the classical fairy tale mushroom. Think about the little red mushrooms with white dots on them. It's an Amanita, Amanita muscaria. And so by being able to definitively identify this as an Amanita and take it off the menu, then the possibilities for being able to safely eat mushrooms are a lot better. This one is one of the most cool looking mushrooms for a couple of reasons. One is that the stem is really long in proportion to the cap. And so the cap has this sort of sticky, viscid or wet, slimy quality to it. The underside has pores. So this is in the Bolete family, and this is called Ostroboletus betula, betula referring to birch. And so the name comes from the likeness of the stem. You see it's kind of shaggy, very much like a river birch tree would be. And so this is Ostroboletus betula. In this case, this is a mushroom that's pretty good edible. The cap is. The stem itself is kind of fibrous, and so not so great, but totally non-toxic. Here's a good example of another type of Amanita. This belongs to a group called Lepidellas, and the Lepidellas are always white, and they have this really warty kind of surface on the cap. So that's that universal veil. As the cap expands, breaking up into little patches, has a ring on the stalk, which is called a partial veil or annulus, and it has this bulb at the base. So this one's called Amanita abrupta. Again, just by picking it up and looking at those features, tells you that this is an Amanita. Beautiful to look at, not something you want to eat. So as you can see, even though it's drying out a little bit, you don't go many steps before there's something else. And so this one, pick it up, look at the underside. This is where it produces its spores. So this is another bolete. And in this case, you know, it has that kind of tan or brownish colored cap and kind of upturned margin. And when I look at those gills, it gives me the impression that maybe this thing has pink spores, because the spore color is a very important thing for being able to separate the different species of any kind of mushroom, particularly boletes. So I can look through a hand lens like this, and I can see some of the spores on the tube mouse there, and indeed they're kind of a pinkish color. That tells me that this is in the genus Tylopilus. So Tylopilus is a large genus, and none of which are poisonous, a few of which are really good to eat, but most which produce this compound that makes it really bitter. And so, because it's not an Amanita and it's in this bolete group, one of the things that we do advocate is taking a small piece of it, just a little piece, put it in your mouth and just kind of chew on it a little bit and then spit it out. And you wait about a minute or two, and if you get the bitter taste, then that tells you that this is Tylopilus phallius, or one of the bitter boletes. Not something you want to eat unless you really like bitter. And it's way too bitter for me. It's not poisonous at all, and which is the case with a lot of mushrooms. And not that they're poisonous, they're just not good to eat. They don't taste good. The diversity is incredible, and so NAMA, it's been 45 years or so that they've been doing these forays in different parts of North America, and the highest count by far of species, and each one they have a compiled list of species, was in Black Mountain. Actually, it was the one the shirt is from, which was, I don't see the date, but it was 20 some years ago, 94. And of course it was a foray honoring a North Carolinian William Chambers Coker, who was one of the early mycologists in the early part of the 20th century. Coker Arboretum in Chapel Hill, Coker Hall, that's William Chambers Coker. And so anyhow, in that foray, in 3 days, we collected over 734 species of mushrooms. And that's, if you imagine, that's just a snapshot of one season. So if it had been a month later or a month earlier, it would have been different ones. But 734 is a pretty diverse group of fungi. And of course, it takes a lot of different people with particular knowledge of different types of mushrooms to really put together a species list that immense. Typically here, we do an afternoon walk. I did one couple weeks ago up at Mount Rogers, and in an hour with a small group of mostly beginners, we picked over 50 species. The weekend before, in 2 days out at Hot Springs, North Carolina, we got well over 100 species. And so it's, it's just really a diverse part of the ecosystem here in the southern Appalachians. So again, pick it up, look at the bottom side, has pores. So this again tells me that this is a bolete. Pretty much all the different species of boletes are mycorrhizal with trees. And so this one, who knows, I mean the matrix of roots that are underground here mean that it could be almost anything that it's partnering with, but typically this is one that partners with conifers. And so this is the graceful bolete, Ostroboletus gracilis, a brownish cap, yellowish stem, and the sort of creamy colored pores. So this is one I really was hoping that we would pick up some to be able to show, because of the summer edibles and the ones that are most common in this area, this is one of them. And so we collect tons of them, and we cook them up and freeze them and preserve them different ways. And so, but this one is, you can see, here's the underside, there's the top side, and just where it's been handled in the process of picking it, you see this milk coming out of it? So this is a white milk, and the gills are sort of a creamy brownish color. You can see there's a lot of latex or milk coming out of this thing. And so, so as I said earlier, with some of the other Lactarius we picked up, you can do this. Touch your finger to it, touch it to your tongue. This is going to be a really mild tasting mushroom. It's not going to be hot at all. And so then after you collect it and you see the milk and you kind of get an approximate identification of what it is, then you put it in your basket, and in maybe 15 or 20 minutes go back and look at it again. And so where this is bleeding white and where it's been bruised is going to turn dark. It's going to be really dark brown. And so by that time it's also starting to develop a very familiar odor. So if you turn it over and smell it from the bottom, even now, it smells a little bit like fish. It could be some kind of seafood. And it has a little bit of that taste to it too, but has a really great texture for cooking. There's many different recipes and ways to prepare this one. Goes by a lot of different names. In West Virginia they call these Bradleys. Out in western North Carolina they call them leatherbacks, or like corrugated milky, because it has this sort of corrugated texture to the cap. But we call it Lactarius carubus. So this is probably the most commonly sought after summer mushroom all over North America in different places. Here starts in late June, early July, and fruits all the way through to the fall. And so you can see it has like these gill-like ridges on the underside, which are a little different than gills, but maybe we can look at that more closely later. But so they grow sometimes in little clusters like this. They have the color can vary. These are faded a little bit. They start out more of an orangey yellow and then fade to lighter yellow. But the pores, the gills on the underside usually keep a deeper shade of that orange color. And so these are called golden chanterelles. There's several different variations of those that grow here, but this one is known as the golden chanterelle, which is Cantharellus cibarius. So in the very beginning of the walk, we came across the black trumpets and we looked at those. So the black trumpets are in the chanterelle family too. And so these are two members of that family. The chanterelle family has lots of really good edibles, and this is one that's very highly prized, and occasionally you can find it in markets, restaurants, and of course in the woods. That's where we find it. Really two different species right here. These smaller ones are called Cantharellus tubiformis, and they have a hollow stem. They're a lot smaller, but they look a little bit like the larger chanterelles. Both are edible and good. The mushrooms that are here, of course, directly relate to the different species of trees and plants that are here. And so as you move along from ridgetop to a ridge cove to hillside, north versus south slopes and that sort of thing, you find very different species growing in those areas. So another gilled mushroom. You injure it, you see it's bleeding. Instead of bleeding white, it's bleeding more like a yellowish latex. And if you did the taste test of this, I won't, because I already know what it's going to be, but this is one of the hot Lactarius milk mushrooms. So it'll have that peppery sensation, not something you want to eat. I'm seeing this mushroom, you can see that it's been knocked over and chewed on a little bit. And I pick it up, and it's one of the corrugated milkies that we've been picking. Good edible, and you can see where the injured parts have turned this dark color, and that's typical of what you're going to see with these. So good opportunity to point out that mushrooms are a really important food for a lot of wildlife. In this case, it looks like probably some kind of smaller rodent, maybe something chipmunk or smaller has been after this one, but we find a lot of the milk mushrooms and different, especially late summer, fall mushrooms that gray squirrels like. And so squirrels eat a lot of them, and you'll often see them turned over like that, and they'll only eat the gills and leave the rest or something like that. And so that's a pretty typical thing. And then also box turtles eat a lot of mushrooms. That's another important food for them. And then also deer eat a lot of mushrooms, particularly in the fall. So, you know, sometimes you have to get out early to get your share of them because everybody's hungry. So, of course, the other thing is color. And when mushrooms are young, they'll tend to have more intense color. This is a very young one. It's just opening up, but it's open enough that on the underside I can see that it's going to have gills, and it has this membrane that's kind of protecting the gills. You can barely see it there, but it looks kind of like a cobweb, and as the cap expands, that breaks loose, and so that's protecting the gills until it's ready to release its spores. And so that's called the cortina, or comes from the same word as curtain or veil. And so this mushroom cap will get much larger. It has this beautiful purple color, and so it belongs to the genus Cortinarius, which is a really large, diverse genus. A lot of different colorful mushrooms during the cooler parts of the year. Generally not recommended for eating. There's a few of them that are edible, but it's another one of those groups that, because of the presence of this cortina, you can identify it to genus, and it's hard to take it to the next step, to species, and so it's a good idea to avoid eating Cortinarius unless you are with somebody who really knows which one you have. So the thing we talked about trying to get all the stem, this is another good example. I got most of it, but not quite. This is a gill mushroom, as you can see. Has a real long, thin stalk, brownish cap with a little umbel, a little bump in the middle of it. And typically this thing has a taproot. Sometimes the taproot can go several inches down into the ground. And so it's gone through a lot of name changes because it doesn't fit easily into any of the other groups of mushrooms. So I first knew it as Callibia radicata, which is fine. It works for me, and it has white spores like most Callibias, all Callibias actually. But then it got moved to another genus because it really didn't fit into Callibia, and so they started calling it Udamanciella radicata. And so it kept that name for many, many years. And then a few years ago, it got moved to Xerula, Xerula, furfuracea, for this sort of, these stalks, the dotted, it's almost like sandpaper on the stalks. And so, you know, in terms of, as a mushroom for the table, the caps are edible and can be pretty good. The stems are just too fibrous. And so it's not one we really go out of our way to pick. But it's beautiful. It's kind of interesting when you see that long taproot. It looks like a carrot. So this is another one of the milk mushrooms. You see the latex bleeding out of it. The tan stem, darker cap, and it has that corrugated texture to it. Sort of creamy colored gills. And so this one is another one of the Lactarius corrugus, or corrugated milky leatherback, very choice edible mushroom. You See a lot of them along this edge. Typically, in terms of numbers, sometimes the highest numbers of mushrooms we get are along the edges of the woods. And it's because of the openness, and of course the roots of the trees are still coming out here. But, you know, this is a little bit like some of the others that we picked, but it does have milk. You can see it's bleeding white, but it has much darker gills, smaller, and has this bump or umbel in the center. So this is a Lactarius, but this is not one of the edible Lactarius, unfortunately, but loves to grow in this mossy banks along the edges of the woods. Fresh specimen of the painted bolete. You can see it has the pore surface on the underside, has a little bit of a ring on the stalk, and then the stalk is kind of furry or scruffy. Has the kind of velvety surface on the cap, red and with a white background. So it's called the painted bolete, Suillus spraguei.